Hi everyone. Hope you guys are doing well and hopefully you guys were happy with the midterm too. It was all multiple choice questions and it was based on the lectures and the problems that I did. Um, so now from today's lecture, we will be starting the last portion of the class. Basically, whatever we are going to start from today until the end of the semester, that will be included in your midterm 3 exam, which is in May. Um, so lecture 16 is what we're going to cover today, and it we are going to discuss about chapter 9. So lecture 16 and 17 are about chapter 9, but lecture 16 specifically talks about fiscal policy, and lecture 17 talks about public debt, which is also covered in chapter 9. So in our previous classes, we have seen there are the different economic models to explain what goes on in the economy. We first look at the classical theory, then we had the Keynesian theory, then we had the new classical theory. So classical theory was the first attempt to create an economic model. Okay, so basically it was the first economic model we used to explain how the economy operates. And if you remember, it says there is flexible interest rate and flexible prices and wages that will bring the economy back to equilibrium in the long run. Now, in the short run, we can have some disruptions or some recessions in the short run, but in the long run, the economy will always adjust to full equilibrium. That's what classical theory said. And we also saw that this theory was not working and it had some flaws. Like during the Great Depression, this theory was not working. What was going on in the economy, and it was not providing any solutions. So this theory asked the correct questions, but it did not provide us with the correct answers. So that's when we moved to the Keynesian theories during the Great Depression, when classical theory was not able to provide us the correct answer. We looked into a different set of ideas, and that's the Keynesian theories, which we also discussed a little bit in details in lecture 15. And basically, under Keynesians, we are still asking the same questions in classical theory: how the economy operates, how the economy will come back to equilibrium in the long run, and how disruptions or recessions or inflations can happen in the economy. However, the answers that are provided by Keynesians are very different than the answers provided by the classical theory. So classical theory and Keynesian theory, these are two different thoughts of economic model. Classical theory and Keynesian theory, they ask the same question, but two of these models provided two very different answers as in how the economy operates. So the Keynesian theory provided us a new way of looking at the economy, but it provided us counter-cyclical tools. So if you remember again, classical theory said we don't need any interference from the government. The economy will adjust automatically in the long run and come back to equilibrium. So that's cyclical, right? So if within the business cycles, the economy moves on to recession and then it comes back up again because it's cyclical. But the Keynesians are saying, or they are providing solutions that are counter-cyclical. They are saying that the economy does not automatically come back to equilibrium, and something else has to be done in order to bring it back to equilibrium. So it focuses on the economy when it is going through recession or when the economy is going through inflation. So similar to any other theories, Keynesian theory is also makes theories, and it is based on the fact that all discretionary and non-discretionary policy decisions. So whatever the decisions the policymakers or the politicians or the government are making under the Keynesian theory, it is based on the beliefs of the policymakers, like what the government believes, what the policymakers believe, and how they see the world, and how they see what the role of the government is in the economy. So based on that, these policies are implemented in the economy to solve the economic problem, to solve the recession or inflation. So then we move on to slide 5, which starts fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is a type of policy under Keynesians. So Keynesian theory. So if you look at the whiteboard, I just want to make sure you understand Keynesian is a Keynesian model, and under this we have fiscal policy. So it is a category, it is a type of Keynesian model, and this is one of the most popular type of policies, and it even exists today. Even if you see today, you will hear that during the coronavirus event, the government is implementing fiscal policy in order to take the economy out of the recession. Many people are losing jobs, people cannot go to work because everyone has to stay at home. So in order to revive the economy, the government is implementing fiscal policy, which is a policy under Keynesian model. Okay, so let's see what is fiscal policy and what are the assumptions and objectives of fiscal policy. So basically, fiscal policy is when the federal government takes any type of actions in terms of changing the tax rate or in terms of changing the government spending in the economy in order to stabilize it. So when the economy is unstable and when the economy is going through a recession or inflation, in that type of scenario, if the government is increasing or decreasing taxes, or if the government is increasing or decreasing government spending, or a combination of the two, then it is fiscal policy. Now I know I spoke a little bit about it in lecture 15, and there was a question on about fiscal policy in their midterm 2 as well. But so that you guys are clear, fiscal policy basically means whenever the economy is going through a recession or inflation, the government either increases or decreases taxes, or the government either increases or decreases government spending, or a combination of these two in order to achieve a stable economy. That is what fiscal policy is. Now, when we look at fiscal policies, there are three assumptions we make. So we need to know the three assumptions, and these are listed in slide 5. So the first assumption is when we are implementing a fiscal policy, we assume that the market is inherently unstable. Now, if the market was stable, if the market was doing well, there is no need to implement fiscal policy. Okay, so that's the assumption. The assumption is only because the market is not doing well, the market is unstable, that's why we are implementing the fiscal policy. Now, if market is doing well, we don't need it. The second assumption about fiscal policy is there are no inbuilt systems in the economy that will bring it back to equilibrium. So remember, this is in contrast with your classical theory. Classical theory said flexible interest rate and flexible wages and prices will bring back the economy to equilibrium. But fiscal policy's assumption is there are no systems in the economy that will bring the economy back to equilibrium in the long run. And the third assumption of fiscal policy is government has the ability and the responsibility to bring the economy back to equilibrium. So under this, it's very evident and clear that the third assumption says the government has a very important role to play under fiscal policy. And when the economy is going through a recession or inflation, it is the government who has the ability and the responsibility to take the economy back to equilibrium by acting. So these are the three assumptions. The market is inherently unstable. There are no inbuilt systems in the economy that will bring it back to equilibrium, and government has the ability and responsibility to act and bring the economy back to equilibrium. Now, these were the assumptions. Now, what about the objectives of fiscal policy? So, the main objective of fiscal policy are very similar to all the other types of policies, monetary policy or classical theory policies, but these are listed in your slide 6. So, basically, in order to help maintain a stable economy in relative to a recession or inflation. So, whenever there is recession, we want to bring the economy back to a stable position, so we use fiscal policy. Then another objective is to encourage economic growth, and a third objective is to promote full employment in order to create employment and so that everyone or most of the people in the economy has jobs. Okay, so then we move on. There are under fiscal policy there are two types of policy. Okay, so fiscal policy can be divided into two types. Fiscal policy, one is discretionary discretionary, second is non-discretionary. Okay, so these are the two types of fiscal policies that we have. First, we're going to talk about discretionary fiscal policy, and after that we're going to talk about non-discretionary fiscal policy. So under the discretionary policy, the government has to act directly, in order to influence the aggregate demand. So basically, when the economy is going through a recession or inflation, the government must do something so that it affects the aggregate demand of the economy directly. So in case, let's say, if the economy is moving too slowly, then aggregate demand needs to be increased. If economy is moving too rapidly, then aggregate demand needs to be decreased. So that's what the government can do. They can come in and interfere in the market and control this aggregate demand to bring the economy back to equilibrium. Now, if the economy is going through a recession, then the government can do two things. They can lower taxes or they can increase government spending. Okay, so again, let's if you think about it, if the economy is going through a recession, the government needs to increase spending or the government needs to decrease taxes. Okay, so let's look at it in terms of the bathtub model. So let's say we have the same bathtub model. We have this bathtub, this is water, again this is output and employment and income, employment and income. And remember, fiscal policy is a type of Keynesian policy, so whatever is coming out of the faucet, whatever water is coming out of the faucet is actually C plus I plus government plus exports, because it's not classical theory. Classical theory assumes there's no government, but Keynesians do believe there's government and international trade. And then we have this faucet, this is the pipe represents the banks, and then this is the leakage. And under Keynesian, if you remember, leakages are savings, tax and imports, anything that's taking the output out of the economy. Now during recession, if we look at it as under a recessionary scenario, if you remember what we said, when there is recession, the government will increase government spending or government will decrease taxes. So in that case, if government is increasing government spending, that means the flow of water will go up. And if government is decreasing taxes, that means less water will come out of the tap. So what will happen to the level of water? The level of water in this case will go up. Okay, so level of water goes up. Okay, now if we think about the opposite scenario, if we think about inflation is when there is too much demand in the market and prices of goods and services are going up significantly. So the government needs to slow down the economy. So they can do that by decreasing the aggregate demand. And there are two things they can do in order to decrease the aggregate demand. They can decrease the government spending or increase the taxes. So again, if we look at it in terms of the diagram, we have the bathtub, this is the faucet, this is bank, water coming out is C plus I plus G plus X, and then leakage is S plus T plus imports, savings plus tax plus imports, same thing. And under recession, this is under inflation. In order to reduce inflation, government will decrease spending or increase taxes. Now if they decrease spending, less water will go into the tub, and if they increase taxes, then more water will be coming out of the out of the tub. So that means the level of water will go down. So in case of inflation, when the government implements fiscal policy, the level of water goes down. Okay, so we have to remember is the main thing that we have to remember is during recession, government wants to increase aggregate demand, and they can do that by increasing government spending or decreasing taxes, which will cause the level of water to go up. And in cases of inflation, the government wants to reduce aggregate demand, and they can do that by decreasing government spending or increasing taxes, and as a result that will cause the level of water to go down. So hopefully that is clear to you guys. And the following slide actually talks about that specifically. If you see that under the discretionary fiscal policy, if taxes are raised, aggregate demand declines. If taxes are lowered, aggregate demand increases and the economy grows. So that's what happens during recession. The above case, that's what happens during inflation. Now again, if government spending increases, then aggregate demand increases and economy grows. So that's again under recession. And the final line is government spending is reduced, aggregate demand decreases and economy slows down. So again, we use this policy under the inflationary conditions. Now moving on to slide 10. No, it again talks about what I just said. During recession, government can revive the economy by lowering taxes or increasing spending, which eventually will increase the aggregate demand. Okay, and on the other hand, it also says the same thing, that if the economy is going through inflation, then government can increase taxes or lower government spending, which will reduce aggregate demand. Now one other thing we have to see is basically, if you think logically, when there is recession, government is increasing spending or decreasing taxes. So what's happening to the tax revenue of the government? The tax revenue of the government is going down, right? Because they're spending more money from their tax revenue, and at the same time, because taxes are going down, they are getting less taxes. So tax revenue of government goes down, and it ultimately creates budget deficit. So we have to take this into account when we are implementing a fiscal policy during recession. It eventually will lead to budget deficit, which means the government is spending more than what they are earning, right? Their government is increasing their spending, but they are decreasing their taxes. If they are decreasing their taxes, they are receiving less tax revenues, but on the other hand, they are spending more. So there is a gap, and that gap is known as the budget deficit. So budget deficit is when the government is spending more than their tax revenue that they are receiving. Now on the opposite hand, if we have inflation, that's when tax revenue of the government will actually go up, right? Because during inflation, government decreases spending or government increases taxes. If they are increasing taxes, they will be getting more tax revenues, and they're decreasing spending, so they're not spending too much. That means they are having more tax revenues. They can save more money, or they can save more tax revenues. So as a result, in that scenario, we will have budget surplus. So important thing to remember, fiscal policy during recession will create budget deficit, and fiscal policy during inflation will create budget surplus. Okay, so because government budget is an important topic, and we have to look into like how deficits can affect the overall economy, how surplus can affect. So that's something politicians and government has to take into account. So sometimes, when Keynesians are recommending that, during recessions, the government should spend more than what they are earning, and it's okay to have deficit, then there are some questions and there are a lot of criticisms. They say, does it make sense for the government to spend more than what they are earning? Does it make sense for the government not to maintain a balanced budget? So basically, these questions come up, and in response to this, Keynesians are saying that in the short run, it is okay to incur deficit as long as we get a long-term stability. So what the Keynesians are saying, the critics of Keynesians say, hey, does it make sense for the government to spend more than what they earn? In general, it's not wise just to spend more than what you earn, right? That's what we think. So that's what the critics are saying. But Keynesians, in response to these critics, are saying, hey, it's okay to spend a little bit more in the short term than your earnings, but as long as we have a long-term stability in the economy, that will create employment for everyone and that will increase output. That's what their Keynesian defense is, that this spending is needed in the short term to get a long-term stability. So, during recessionary periods, if government increases spending or reduces taxes, the net effect is an increase in AD as less money flows out of the tap. Lower taxes and more flows into the tap. So it's just when we have the opposite scenario, when we have lower taxes, then we will have more flow into the dam, and that means an increased spending. So that's what we were talking about, or how I showed you in the bathtub model, and that creates a budget deficit when we have too much spending or lower taxes, and when we decrease spending and increase taxes, that's we are going to have budget surplus. Okay, so another question that comes up from the public under fiscal policy is it right for the government to spend more money than tax revenues? And also, how are they spending the money? Which industry are they spending the money? Or what will that money be spent for? Is it like for healthcare? Is it for education? Or is it for airlines? So people want to know where the government is spending the money. And also they want to know, as government increases taxes, or if government is lowering taxes, who are they doing it for? Is it for the middle class, or is it for the wealthy class, or is it for the poor people? Who are they lowering the taxes, or who are they increasing the taxes? These are questions that public ask to politicians or the government when they are trying to implement fiscal policies. So these are some of the disadvantage, I would say, related to fiscal policy. Again, the main response to this type of question is, hey, in the short term, it is okay to incur some deficit as long as we have the benefits in the long term outweigh the short term deficit. As long as we have a stability, more output and employment, then it's okay to have a short term deficit. So, the federal government is in a unique position to influence business cycles. By decreasing and increasing spending, or increasing or decreasing taxes, they can affect the business cycle. And the primary reason for this is because federal government largely controls the supply, or at least the ability to refinance indebtedness. Or in other words, basically, they can control the business cycles by increasing spending or decreasing spending, because they control the money supply in the economy. So the federal government plays an important role in controlling the money supply. So in the scenario like we were just talking about, in the scenario when we have budget deficit, so let's again assume we have recession. If we have recession, in this case, we will have budget deficit for the government, right? Government government will spend more than the tax revenues that they will earn. More than the tax revenues they will earn, right? So scenario, in this scenario, in this scenario, how is the government getting this extra money? They are spending more than their income. So what is the source of this money, or what is the source that the government can finance that deficit? What is the source that government can finance the deficit? So we need to know, because when government is spending more than what they're earning, how what where they are getting the money from, how they are covering up this deficit. So if we go back to our slide, they can do this. Is in slide 18. If you see, they can finance the deficit in two ways. They can either borrow money through the issuance of bonds, and this is done by the US Treasury. So the US Treasury, basically they will issue bonds which and through which they can borrow money. They will sell the bonds to the people, and in return to the banks and to the general public, and return get money. So that's one way they can get money, and we will learn more about this in the later chapter under monetary policy. And the other way they can finance the deficit is, basically they can virtually create money. They can print more money, and this is done through the Federal Reserve. So borrowing money through the issuance of bonds, that's through the Treasury, US Treasury, and creating or printing money is through the Federal Reserve. So these are the two ways they can finance that deficit. So it is always preferred to borrow money through the issuance of bonds, because when you spend borrowed money, it does not create inflation. On the other hand, if you print more and more money, it will create inflation. The price of goods and services will start going up, and that will be another problem. So out of these two options in slide 18, the first option is a preferred method because it does not create inflation, whereas the second option actually creates inflation in the market. But either ways, they can use any one of the two to cover the deficit, but the first one is actually the preferred one. Okay, so now as we are talking about budget deficit and budget surplus, under in the US and in the world, there are different budget philosophies, or there are different philosophies related to budget. Okay, so basically, many people believe that the government should maintain budget under certain ways, and based on that, it has been categorized into three different types. Okay, so there are basically three types of budgetary policies or philosophies. So three budgetary philosophies. So basically these philosophies say how the budget of the government should be maintained. These are three different ways the government budget can be maintained. That's what we are saying, the three different ways the government can maintain their budget. First one is called annually balanced budget. Okay, what this says is, annually balanced budget, under this philosophy, the government must balance the budget at the end of the year. So on December 31st, the budget must be zero. There won't be any surplus, there won't be any deficit, and it has to be zero. So basically, even if there is some surplus or even if there is some deficit, adjustments have to be made at the end of the year so that it comes back to zero. That is annually balanced budget. This is not very common. This does not make sense, because if you are trying to improve the economy and you're spending more, incurring budget deficit, and then at the end of the year, let's say you're taking the policy in November, and then in December 31st you have to revert it back, then the effect is not there on the economy. So it does not make sense to have annually balanced budget. The philosophy is there, but rarely anybody uses annually balanced budget. So that's what it is. Okay, then the second philosophy for budgetary how governments should keep budgets is called cyclically balanced budget. So cyclically balanced budget says, the budget of the government should be adjusted or should be balanced based on the business cycle. Now, if you remember, a business cycle looks like this. If you remember, we learned in chapter 6. So they're saying from the beginning to the end of a business cycle, when we reach the end of the business cycle, we should balance the budget of the government. That's exactly what this philosophy is saying. So basically, at the end of the business cycle, the the government should balance the budget. Now this is very difficult to administer. This might make sense logically, but it's very difficult to administer, because for some business cycles are longer, some business cycles are shorter, and we cannot exactly predict how long a business cycle will be. Will it be 3 years? Will it be 4 years? Or will it be 7 years? We don't know. We cannot correctly predict a business cycle. So that's why this also becomes a little bit difficult. So although this philosophy is out there, but it becomes a little bit difficult. And last one, which is the one that's used in the US and makes most sense, is called the functional finance budget. Under this theory, or under this philosophy, the focus is not on balancing the budget, but the focus is on the stability of the economy. So under this, the third type of philosophy, we are focusing on how we can stabilize the economy, and we are not focusing on balancing the budget of the government. Okay, and again, this theory says that in the short term, it is okay to have some deficits or surplus as long as we have a long-term growth or a long-term stability. That's what this one is saying, the functional finance budget. So focus is not on budget, focus is on the economic growth and long-term stability. And basically, it is okay to have some short-term deficits or surplus as long as we have employment, output, and stability in the long run. So these are the three budgetary philosophies that we have, and you need to know this. These will be in your multiple choice questions, so make sure you know the different types of budget philosophies. So these will cover slide 20, 21, and 22, 23. 20, 21, and 22 basically talks about these three different budget philosophies. So far what we discussed is whatever we discussed about fiscal policy is related to discretionary fiscal policy. But if you remember, in the beginning of the class, I said there are two types of fiscal policy: discretionary fiscal policy and non-discretionary fiscal policy. So now we move on to discuss non-discretionary fiscal policy. So non-discretionary fiscal policy is basically, in this type of scenario, the government does not have to act. The government already has built some mechanisms in the economy, and these will be triggered when there is a fall in employment or when there is a fall in output. So basically, when we talk about discretionary policy, that's when we are saying the government has to act. They increase taxes, decrease taxes, or they increase spending or decrease spending. So they have to act. But in case of non-discretionary fiscal policy, these are also set up by the government. They don't have to act. These will be automatically triggered when the level of employment and the level of output goes down under a certain point, or goes up above a certain point. Okay, so some of the examples that we have to look under non-discretionary policies would be your tax rate. If you think, let's say last year you had a very good income and you made like $90,000, so your, let's say, average tax rate was 19%. Federal tax rate was around 19%. Now this year, due to coronavirus, you lost your job and your income will probably be around $50,000. So you will be coming down to a lower tax bracket, right? Your tax rate will probably be 15% now, because your overall income in the year is lower. So see, the government did not have to make any actions. This system was already into the system. This system was already built into the economy, and when your income decreased, your tax rate also decreased. So the tax rate adjusts with your income. So that's an example of non-discretionary fiscal policy, where it is triggered when there is a decrease in income. Another example of non-discretionary fiscal policy is unemployment insurance. Okay, like during inflation, when economy is doing well, people work more and they pay more premiums towards the unemployment insurance program. But during recession, when people are losing jobs, these premiums are paid out. So again, when the level of employment falls, unemployment insurance are paid out. When level of employment goes up, the premium goes up. So that's another example of non-discretionary policy. Now, one thing that does not change or that does not adjust with the level of employment or level of output is certain government subsidy programs. Okay, they do not adjust, they remain fixed, and they will not adjust. So these are not non-discretionary. This is basically it will not adjust. An example is the social security. No matter where we are, whether it's recession or no matter whether it's recession or inflation, social security will remain the same. So this is something that does not adjust. Okay, so that's non-discretionary fiscal policy. It's something that the government does not have to actively participate or engage in, but the government has already built up tools or systems into the economy which gets triggered when there is a decrease in economic activity or when a decrease in employment. Okay, so fiscal policy, there are some advantages and disadvantages of fiscal policy. So if you look at slide 27, it talks about the advantages. So fiscal policy is very powerful and it is a very important tool. Government often uses this. Even now they are using it. When we say the government is providing $2 trillion stimulus program, that's part of fiscal policy. So it's very important that you understand fiscal policy, and it is very powerful and it is very effective, especially to handle recession. Maybe not that much for inflation, but to handle recession, fiscal policy is very effective and powerful. Okay, and then the second advantage is it targets specific groups or different parts of the economy. Whether you are spending on defense or whether you're spending on healthcare or whether you're spending on training programs. So it depends, basically it can target specific industries, and it can, that's very helpful. Like during this period, if you think during the coronavirus, which industries have been affected the most? The airline industry, the restaurant industry, and the hotel industry, right? And when the government provided the stimulus, they had specific budgets for the airline industry, for the restaurant industry, and then for the other small businesses. So basically, it helps to target specific groups, which makes it more effective. But as always, as with all policies, this fiscal policy also have disadvantages. First of all, it takes a long time to get implemented. There's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of political realities. The House has to approve it, the Senate has to approve it, then it goes to the president approves it, and then it's implemented. So it's a lot of political bureaucracy, lot of steps before it gets implemented, and by the time it's implemented, probably the economy is moving in a different direction. It usually takes 3 to 6 months to show the impact of this fiscal policy, and by then probably the economy is already moving into a different direction. So that's one disadvantage. The other disadvantage of discretionary fiscal policy is in the last slide, or slide 29, is that it causes crowding out effect. Again, you know what crowding out effect is based on previous lectures, but what it means is government, when they increase spending, they are taking out all the savings in the economy. That means there's no funds available for the private sector. So private sectors cannot make investments because there's not enough funds available in the banks, and as a result, private investments are driven out of the market. That's what's called crowding out effect. So those are the disadvantages, and that finishes our lecture 16. Basically whatever we talked about is all related to fiscal policy, and you can relate it to what's going on now, what the government is doing now. You can relate it if you truly understand what fiscal policy means. You can see a lot of things the government administration is doing right now. You can see a lot of similarities. Now next week we will start lecture 17, which basically finishes chapter 9 and also starts chapter 10. But till then, stay safe. If you have any questions, email me. I will be happy to help you. Thank you.